interview portion of the Turn the Page podcast Spooky Reads episode. Today, I'm really excited to welcome to the podcast Gina Blaxill. Gina is a Carnegie-nominated YA thriller writer. Her latest novel, Good Enough to Eat, is a dark feminist retelling of Hansel and Gretel. Here's Gina to tell us more.
Right, so I'm Gina Blaxill and I've written 6 YA books now. So most recently I've written 2 fairy tale retellings, kind of for the younger YA age group. Good Enough to Eat, which we're going to be talking about today, and also in the background, also a Red Riding Hood retelling called All the Better to See You. But as well as that, I released earlier this year a YA thriller, slightly older end, I think, called You Can Trust Me. The things that they have in common, they're all sort of quite dark books, and I think they've all got a mystery at their core and an element of whodunit. So yes, even though fairy tales and kind of contemporary life aren't that similar, there is a common thread between them.
Is that a cat I saw then?
It is a cat. I thought you were going to get a tail.
Oh, that's fine. We do actually tend to get quite a lot of cats on these interviews.
I think they're very attracted towards laptops.
Yes, brilliant. So going back to Good Enough to Eat, we know it's a Hansel and Gretel retelling. I've loved it. Could you tell us a little bit about sort of what it's about, what readers can expect from it?
Okay, so Good Enough to Eat, I guess it's a dual time frame Hansel and Gretel retelling. So in it, we cover what happens in the fairy tale as you know it. So we get to see Hansel and Gretel going into the creepy forest, leaving that trail of, I think it's breadcrumbs in the original, but it's pebbles in my version. We get to see them in the witch's cottage. You get to see all of the things that you would expect there, but with twists, because it's not straightforward.
Yeah.
But what you also get to see in that other time frame is what happens after Hansel and Gretel return from the witch's cottage. So Good Enough to Eat really continues that story. And as for what's in store, well, you've got the twists, you've got some very complex characters. I've written quite a lot of strong feminist girls in my time, but I think Gretel is probably the most badass of those.
I love her so much.
Oh, brilliant. She's quite unlikable in parts because she's quite complex. So she's very morally grey.
She is badass though. Perfect word to describe her.
Oh, she very much is. She challenged me, I can tell you that. But you can also expect some witchiness, which probably isn't a surprise because, hello, there is a witch in that cottage who is rumoured to possibly eat children. There's a little bit of romance. There's lots of food, especially baked goods. So if you're hungry when you read, I advise you have something next to you because you'll probably want to snack on it.
What is your favourite snack when you're reading or writing, actually, on that?
Oh, gosh. So when I'm really in the zone, I don't actually tend to eat that much. And when I'm reading, there's nothing more decadent than having some chocolate there, which is really unoriginal.
I have to say, I was reading Good Enough to Eat and all I wanted was gingerbread. Like just constantly gingerbread and hot chocolate was all I wanted to eat.
Yes, definitely hot chocolate. I'm not an enormous fan of gingerbread, but I've definitely made quite a bit of it since writing this book. And this year I really do want to try making a gingerbread house again, because it just, if I'm not going to do it this year, when am I going to do it?
Brilliant. And it, like I said, it was a great story. I loved it so much. But what was it about the Hansel and Gretel, the original fairy tale, or which version of the original fairy tale, if there is one, inspired you to write this story and then give it a feminist twist?
Right, so Hansel and Gretel's always been one of the fairy tales I've quite liked, I think because it's so visual with the gingerbread house and the idea of gingerbread children and people being chucked in ovens is just so dark. I mean, going back to the fairy tale as an adult, I actually realised that it's all about parental abandonment, which went over my head when I was a kid completely. But I have always liked the fairy tale. But I suppose in terms of the feminist twist, I've always felt like Gretel gets really passed over in the classic fairy tale because she's the one who always classically has pushed the witch into the oven and freed Hansel, and she gives, I think, the chicken bone to Hansel, or maybe it's his idea in the original. I'm not sure. There are different versions, but she's very much there. And yet Hansel always gets billed as the one who's brave, who has the ideas, despite the fact that Gretel's got that freedom of movement. She must engage with the witch. She actually kills the witch in the fairy tales. So yeah, I think she gets passed over. But also, I guess more broadly with fairy tales, they've got women in them. They're not passed over, but the women often fall into archetypes. They're either kind of innocent princess-like, or they're horrible witches. And you've also got the witch in Hansel and Gretel, who's just out and out evil. And in Good Enough to Eat, she's a little bit more complicated than that. So there's a feminism coming through via Gretel and what she wants, but also Esther, who's the witch character. So I just thought it was an interesting one to play about with, because you've got two very strong women doing most of the legwork in terms of the story.
Yeah, and I love that. I love that Gretel is much more complex character. I like that you've sort of, I'm not going to give anything away, but I like that you had her leaving the trail of pebbles, because I think in the original that I read, it was Hansel who did that. And I love the way that you've done it. I love that she has her own motivations, and Esther as well is a great character. It's so different than what you expected. So yeah, I really love what you've done there. You've said that Gretel was one of your most sort of not challenging, but one of the characters you loved writing. But who was your favourite character to write in the story? Was it Gretel or perhaps Esther? Or
it was not actually Gretel who is my most favourite to write. Often with my books, the main character doesn't end up being my most favourite, just because if they're appearing in every scene, normally I have to do lots of editing. Sometimes they're hard to write. I do a lot of work on them. So normally by the time I'm done writing, I'm like, okay, right, I need a break from you. And I do really love Gretel and I admire her, but she was difficult and tricky because she treads that line between likability. I did also really enjoy writing Esther because she's quite funny. She doesn't care about anything. But overall, I probably most enjoyed writing Jacob, who's an original character. He's the son of the local governing lord. I think because he's quite a nice character who challenges Gretel and talks to her about what she's doing, but mostly in a non-confrontational way. And I think when you've got so much complexity and so much darkness, when you've got a character who is at their core actually quite sweet, that's quite liberating to write. So I really enjoyed him.
yeah, and he's quite refreshing as well. And I'm actually glad that you told me the pronunciation then, because I wasn't sure whether it was Jacob or Jakob, because that's sort of the spelling as well. So I'm glad.
I've always thought of it as Jacob because they've got mainly kind of
Yeah.
German sounding names, because Hansel and Gretel are. If I'm doing it wrong, I'm doing it wrong.
So obviously you talked earlier about how you've written other fairy tale retellings. You've written All the Better to See You, which is a Red Riding Hood tale. So what is it about fairy tales in particular that sort of draw you in, and why do you like giving them a darker twist? I mean, I know they're dark to start with, but you do give them a darker twist.
I think it's because when you've got something that's quite dark and horrible, the kind of my instinct is always to see if it could be darker and to pick it apart a little bit. And you're totally right that fairy tales at their core are just incredibly dark and nasty. Like with Good Enough to Eat, I've been asked by quite a few parents of sort of younger children, is this okay for my kid to read? And I've always said it's quite dark, but it's not darker than the original content, which is very true. But I think what really draws me towards fairy tale retellings is the fact that we all know fairy tales. I think, 99 out of 100 people could tell you what Hansel and Gretel's about because we get exposed to them as kids. And that means that as an author, I know that my readership is coming to it with quite a good understanding of what they expect. And that kind of gives you a unique opportunity to kind of play with that because you know that they've got knowledge. And unless you're doing a retelling, I don't think you have that as an author.
Yeah, they're quite universally known and understood. But so when you come to sort of sitting down and writing it, are there bits that you think, right, I'm going to keep this, but I want to change this and I want to enhance this? And obviously with Gretel, you've sort of enhanced her backstory and her drives and her motivations. Is there anything else that in particular you look at that you want to change, that you want to sort of twist and manipulate almost?
I think it's mainly characters that I feel like that about, because the characters in the original fairy tales are quite sketchily drawn because they're more about the story and sometimes the lesson that the reader's got to learn. So I think it's those that I'm most drawn to. When I'm retelling something, I try and keep the main events that you expect in place. So for example, with this one, there's got to be a gingerbread house. There's got to be rumours that the witch eats people. And there kind of are gingerbread people, albeit in a different way. I would only ever take a story thing and make it completely different if I kind of had to do that for the storyline to make sense. I mean, there's a small tweak in this one that it's not a trail of crumbs, it's a trail of pebbles. And that's simply because if they're crumbs, they just get eaten by forest creatures.
Yeah. Brilliant. So is there another fairy tale that you'd love to write, or maybe you're even working on? Is there something there?
There's so many ones that I'd love to write, including some more obscure ones. One that I've always thought is completely horrible is Rumpelstiltskin. It has this poor girl who sometimes, I think she's mostly a peasant girl, who has to like spin all of this stuff into gold and silver. And it's really weird and wacky. And you've got Rumpelstiltskin who helps her and then gets so irate when she guesses his name, but he just sort of, you know, slams his foot down and just disappears through the floorboards. I'm not quite sure how I'd retell that, but it's just really weird. So I'd love to do that one, actually.
Yeah, and do you sort of try and build the feminism into all of your stories? I mean, that one would work really well because she has to be clever to figure out his name. So is that sort of a running theme for you, something that is important to you?
Yeah, it very much is. I mean, with this series, it was very much in my head that, you know, we want to make them feminist. And that's a conversation I've had with Scholastic as well. But it is an interest of mine going way back. And the YA thriller that I've written, You Can Trust Me, is definitely strong feminism as well. So as well as being something that I thought, yes, I need and want to do this, it's just something that happens naturally because it's where my interests lie. And I think it just feels very relevant to young girls today to have those kinds of figures. It would feel weird to me writing a main female character like the YA heroines that we maybe saw like even 15, 20 years ago.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. So what do you like most? I should say our podcast episode, the theme is spooky books. Obviously, it's coming up to Halloween, so that's what we're focusing on. So what do you like most about writing sort of spooky books? What is it that you love? What draws you to them? What you enjoy putting in there?
Oh, there's lots of stuff. So I've always liked nasty books, basically, whether that is creepy and scary or it's horrible people doing some horrible things, as long as there's some likability in there. So spooky season is definitely right up my street, whether that's sort of straight up spooky, like ghosts or vampires or werewolves, or whether it's kind of spooky adjacent, I guess, like murder mysteries. But I think with those books, I really like that you can explore something dark, but you've got the reader who's a step divorced from that. So you're exploring some horrible themes through a book that hopefully readers won't have to encounter in real life, although some of them sadly do. So yeah, I just guess it's that safety blanket for exploring dark things.
That's great. Do you ever find it challenging to sort of write for, so obviously you write young adults, so do you find it challenging to aim it at a younger audience? Do you always sort of have that desire to go really dark and maybe too dark for your audience? Do you have to rein that in?
I don't know what too dark would even be. I think my kind of my level of dark fits really well within YA. And I haven't tried writing something for adults, but I think if I did, I probably wouldn't go much darker. I've kind of found my natural zone there, really. And there's a few moments I can think of in some of my books where I've done something that's just a bit too nasty, and an editor or agent put a note there saying, let's rein this back a little bit. But that's one of the great things about book writing, that there are other people to keep you in check.
Yeah. So obviously we're sort of in the middle of autumn now. So what's your favourite thing about autumn or about Halloween?
Okay, so full disclosure, I'm not the most massive fan of Halloween, although I like dark stuff. I think it's just the sort of, you know, cheesy pumpkins and ghosts and everything aren't quite my bag because they're quite naff, though they are also quite fun. But I think with autumn, what I like, it's just the colours that you get, especially around now. You can have trees that range from green to orange to brown to red, and aesthetically it's just lovely. And I think it's particularly nice because it only lasts quite a slim period of time before all the leaves come down and it's just muddy and depressing.
And I think with your books, the types of books that you write, particularly these fairy tale retellings, I think a lot of the time we can associate them with this time of year. Do you sort of get a lot of inspiration for those books from the season, from this particular season? So sort of the setting and things.
Definitely. I think the days when the nights start drawing in and you have less daylight obviously lend themselves towards dark books, just because darkness itself is inherently quite scary. And although sometimes in summer you can maybe have the contrast of the blazing sun and nasty things happening, I don't find that personally quite as evocative as just the darkness and the bite of the cold and all of these things. Yeah. I think out of everything I've written, they've pretty much all been like autumn or winter books. So that's clearly somewhere I naturally gravitate towards.
Yeah, and perfect for reading whilst cuddled under a blanket and just hiding from the bad
with
weather.
The hot chocolate or the gingerbread or whatever.
Yes. Brilliant. So could you recommend 3 spooky books or something in that region by other authors for our listeners, please?
Oh, yes. So I gave this some thought before coming on, because when you just get asked that question, your mind blanks. And there's a lot of things that I could recommend, but I am going to narrow it down to 3. And they're all YA books. So first of all, a book that's come out very recently called The Haunting of Tyrese Walker by J.P. Rose, which I read an early version of. It's set in Jamaica, so it's got a lot of Jamaican folklore and actually really well juxtaposes the kind of the heat and the brightness with incredibly creepy things. So she does that amazingly well. I'm not going to lie, parts of this book were almost too much for me. I have quite a high threshold for things, but there are particularly some things to do with bugs that even when I look back, I think, oh my goodness, almost too much. So I'd recommend The Haunting of Tyrese Walker. A second book I'd recommend, very similar title. We have The Haunting of Lindsay, I'll say that again. I always say Lindsay because I've got Lindsay friends. The Haunting of Lindy Pennyworth by S.M. Pope. This is quite a classic ghost story, but it has enough twists so that it feels familiar yet different at the same time, which is really difficult to pitch sometimes. And it's a ghost story. It has a lot of Victoriana, and it has some interesting cemeteries in Oxford and also Highgate that feature. And I lived in Highgate in London for quite a few years, and I went to Highgate cemeteries. So that part I really enjoyed. So if you like Victoriana and ghosts, that's definitely one for you. And I guess the third one I'd recommend, which again is recent, is Big Bad Me by Aislinn O'Loughlin. And that is like a funny werewolf vampire story. And it's just, it feels, I didn't really watch Buffy when Buffy was airing, but I had a friend who was obsessed with Buffy. So I kind of feel like I've got Buffy steeped into my blood. And Big Bad Me definitely kind of evokes Buffy the Vampire Slayer and those types of programs. And it's just really fun and it's refreshing. And I think sometimes with horror books, they do steer quite close to comedy as well, and Aislinn does that really well.
Yeah. Oh, thank you so much for those. They are great. Just jumping back really quickly, you just mentioned sort of graveyards, and it made me think about sort of settings for stories. And I know both of your fairy tales have obviously woods and forests feature quite heavily. Would you say that's kind of your favourite setting, or would you include sort of graveyards or anything else, sort of like a spooky setting that is your go-to?
I would love to do a graveyard, because I realise that both of these 2 fairy tellings have got creepy woods in them, which is quite funny. And actually, You Can Trust Me has a creepy wood in as well. So I think I'd like to step away from creepy woods and forests.
There's nothing wrong with a creepy wood.
No, I think it's just with them, it's the idea that it's a wide space, but you've also got claustrophobia. But I'd love to do something that was set in a graveyard or creepy other natural feature. One thing I've always thought is really disturbing is caves, and that idea of claustrophobia that genuinely terrifies me. So I might have to steel myself up before putting something like that in a book.
Yeah, it is quite scary. It's good to sort of give the reader that aspect of claustrophobia and sort of put them on edge as well.
Exactly.
Yeah. Brilliant. So right, we're on our final question. It's gone so quickly. Could you please tell us when Good Enough to Eat is coming out in the UK and where our listeners can find out more information about you and your other books as well, please?
Yeah, absolutely. So Good Enough to Eat came out last Thursday, the 13th of October. So it's available now, so you can get hold of it. Your local indies would always be first point of call, because got to support the indies.
Yeah.
But you can also get it from all the regular booksellers like Waterstones or Amazon online. You can
Brilliant.
find out more about me at my website, which very inventively is ginablaxill.co.uk. My surname doesn't have an H in it. It is misspelt an awful lot, but it is Blaxill. And you can also find me on Twitter and Instagram and TikTok as well. And it's the same on all of them. It's at Gina Blaxill, all one word. Nice
Brilliant.
to be original there.
I've actually heard that your TikTok is quite impressive. I'm not actually on TikTok. I'm one of those strange people who isn't on it yet. But I've heard that yours is quite good. So I need to get on there and follow you on there as well. And we'll put a link to all of your socials and your website, so there's no misspellings on the blog post when the podcast goes live. But thank you so much for joining us today. I feel like it's gone so fast, but I've learned so much about your books and about you. And it's been really lovely.
Fast. Yeah, I'm quite disappointed that you haven't had more cats, because they always come along, but apart from one tail, that's it.
Well, Good Enough to Eat is fantastic, and I'll recommend it to everybody. And thank you so much again for joining us today.
Oh, it's a pleasure, Kay. Thank you so much for having me on.
Thank you, Gina.
Thank you.